On this cold and blustery day, Jess and I would like to take you on a journey that begins a long, long time ago. The story begins in the olden days on the foredeck of Brupeg, having just rebuilt the anchor and added in some strengthening under the deck to make it lovely. Everything was magical. Things were turning and making the good noises, and the people of Brupeg were so happy. And then Jess pointed to an oil leak that I'd missed when I rebuilt this thing, as well as a whoopsie on the shaft, which made Daddy Bear very annoyed because he had to pull the whole thing apart again. But pull it apart we did, and we got to see the insides of the winch again. And look, we squirted the oil out that we'd just squirted in, and then we lifted the heavy parts and put them on the bench while we were being filmed. And there was parts galore, look at them all. They all came from the inside of the winch, and we unbolted the winch using the massive tools and the muscles involved in that as well. Luckily we had the crane. That helped us lift it off the deck so that we didn't have to do the physical grunt work. We dropped it onto the trolley, we rolled it around the boat, and then we heaved, and it was in the ute, where we could see the crack. We took all of the bits into town and we got them repaired, and while that was happening we cut a big slab of steel because we thought, no, we need to fix the deck. So we drilled some holes so the winch could bolt to the deck. That brings us to the present day, where we started welding the slab to the deck. That also meant it was time to make a witch's brew and start cleaning up the housing so that we could reassemble the winch. And by golly, did we zap it! Look at it! Look at all the zapping!
A stroll downtown this evening when I heard music echo through the night. The same old songs that I heard the night before. So I started running so I wouldn't be too late. I didn't think that I would ever see your face again, but I was wrong. Yeah, I was wrong.
With this slab now welded to the deck, it's time to start getting some paint on so that we can get the winch put together and bolted down. The process we use on Brupeg is first step phosphoric acid. This is essentially rust kill or a phosphoric acid base, and it turns iron oxide, which is rust, into iron phosphate and gives a real solid bite for the next layer of paint. The next layer of paint that we use is Gearbox 90, which is an epoxy 2-pack, and we put that straight onto buffed rust kill. While the rust kill does its thing up on the deck, it's time to start getting into this anchor winch, and the reassembly involves a hell of a lot of cleaning.
Devotion brings me down. That without my love for the ocean, I will be no one. No
these seals have a metal band around the outside of them, and they're flexible on the inside. You can sort of see that middle is basically flexy, and that's what rubs up against the shaft, and it's spring loaded. You can see in the back there's a spring coming through. Basically that spring constantly pulls down on the rubber seal around in here, and then the pressure, because of the direction that the rubber seal is in, essentially, because of the pressure of any oil or whatever on this side, it actually forces the seal back onto the shaft. So they work really, really well, and theoretically if these are working right, you'll have no oil leaks. So we have 2 small and 2 larger seals. This is for the bottom shaft, the worm drive shaft, and then these ones up here, the bigger seals, these are for the, that's not good. That's not good. They shouldn't be able to be pressed in by hand. That's, don't like that. I'll deal with that in a minute. Yeah, but these ones here, these are tight. They should be tight. You shouldn't be able to press them in. That one there feels a wee bit loose. But the trick is get a socket that fits the outside like that. So if I take this out, you can see the diameter of this outside is about the same as the diameter of that socket there. And that means that when you're pressing down, using the socket to press down, you're actually pressing on the metal ring, not any of the rubber parts, so you're not going to damage the seal. So the seal goes in like that, with the flat side facing out. And then very gently, just take your hammer, and you just want to, I like to hold around the edge of the, try and do it backwards, there we go. I like to hold around the edge and make sure that the socket is always staying exactly where it needs to. It's best to do this in a press if you can, so then you get it a bit squarer, but if you can't, this is good enough. Alright, and then the finger check is basically running it around the edge there to make sure that it's even the whole way around. So that's in there, lovely. Now, sometimes you'll end up with a ringland on the back here, so you can only press it in so far. Let me see. Here's one that's got a ringland, and there's another example. So a big one and a small one, both of them have a ringland. You just press it in until you hit that. Here's an example of one with no ringland whatsoever. So you can see there, it literally just goes in and holds in by friction. That's a bit terrifying. Normally they're like this. I'm not sure why they built that like this on this particular housing. It's actually one of the, it should be exactly the same as that. I don't know why it's different, but it is. So anyway. These are very loose. For some reason these ones here are very, very loose. This one literally just drops in. You see that there? It absolutely shouldn't drop in that easy. So either this wouldn't have rusted away so much that it's evenly taken out clearance. It would have been machined wrong. And either this seal is made too small or this housing is made too big. I dare say it's going to be the housing and not this seal. However, looking at this, you can see there's gasket goo all the way around. So this has been a problem before. I assembled this last time, so it must have found exactly the same problem last time and thought, hey, that's not really good, and I put in a sealant to essentially glue these in. I'm going to go and do the same again because that's absolute crap. So there is a slight taper, so when it gets down it's tight, but at the top here it's very loose. So yeah, these are scarily not holding themselves in, and this one particularly, because there's no ringland over here, you're just relying on friction on what is a pretty rubbish surface to hold it in there. So yeah, these definitely need to be held in with something. Look at that, I can push it in by hand. Crazy. Turns out last time when I did this I used grey RTV or silicon. Now I'm not 100% certain if it's the right stuff to use, but it seemed to hang on quite well, so I'm just going to go with it again. These are quite exposed out on the side, so if they fail, they're really quite easy to actually get to. You can replace them all in situ. You don't have to rip the whole winch apart to get to them. So I'm not too stressed about these ones. It's the smaller ones that are a real pain in the neck to get to. Thankfully, those seem to be okay. golden rule of any sort of sealant like this. Trev actually taught me this rule. Golden rule is as soon as you open a can of, whether it's a tube or a can or whatever, of sealant of any type, it is going to get every single place you don't want it to go. Anchor locker, chain, your partner's handbag, wherever, it's going to get there. While I'm waiting on the RTV on those seals to dry, it's time to give this a buff off. It's had 2 coats of rust kill, so now it's ready to start putting some epoxy primer onto. Okay, I'm migrating from metalworking bench where I glued those seals in yesterday, and I am zooming down the front of the boat. I need a place to clean everything, give it a real good scrub before I assemble it. So to orientate where you are, front of the boat here, I've got this just plywood bench set up here, but the reason why I want it here is I've got access to water so that I can wash, but if you follow that cable all the way up, it's directly under the crane, and then the crane can swing around and put everything on this bench, and this is going to be my assembly bench. This is a nice clean bench to work on. So there's 2 reasons why I want to assemble the winch up on the top of the boat here. One is it's an easy environment to keep clean, so there's not much dust up here, it's pretty easy to sort of manage. The second is once it's assembled, it's a bloody solid lump of steel, this thing. I don't know what the weight is, maybe 150 kg, 200, something like that, which is roughly 67,000 foot-pounds, I think. So once we've got this assembled, I don't want to have to try and lift it up over the side of the boat and then swing it around and drop it. We probably could with the crane, but I'd much prefer just to be able to pick it up from here and drop it straight forward, so much less risk, much less distance involved. Alright, so cleaning kit involves basically wire wheel, 240 grit sandpaper. In this case you could use emery tape, which is the norm, but I don't have any, so I'm just going to use some 240 grit sanding discs. They do the same job. And the most important part is a couple of files. So you can sort of see here, like this is the old gasket silicone RTV that's just sort of stuck on the surface, the mating surface. You've got your 2 bearing surfaces in here, and then you've got a couple of edges. It's quite common when these things are getting knocked about, being cleaned or whatever in acid baths and things, you get dents in these areas here, or sometimes you'll get scuffs in these areas down in here, and it can essentially bugger up your bearings. If you get a nick in here or whatever, you can have oil leaks, or physically the bearing won't mount properly, or it might even squeeze the bearings in and you get tight spots. So you want to go through and check all of that before you start assembling. The first step is just get rid of all of the gaskets that are on there. Cool, that's nice and clean. Right, the next stage is getting rid of any nicks and burrs. So you want to go through and make sure, hold your file flat. Oh, there we go, perfect example. Right there, there's a little bit of something sticking up, possibly from when we were doing the electrolysis, a little bit of a zap or something. That there will hold the 2 parts, when they're mated together, it'll hold it apart. So you want to get rid of that. That's the sound you should hear. Essentially nothing coming off. That sound means there's something to deal with. Alright, so our mating surface now is pretty clean. What we're going to do now is just check for any burrs in here. Now, never file down, because then you can gark this. I always try to file up, away from the bearing surface. And you want to do like a 45-degree angle. That's all you need, just to make sure that there's nothing weird hanging out there. Cool. So you do that same thing if you're doing like big ends or rod ends on an engine. You do that same check as well to make sure there's no rubbish that's going to deal, damage to your bearings as you put them in. Final thing I like to do is give these surfaces a bit of a sand up. So you can do this with emery tape is the norm. I'm just using some 240 grit sandpaper. So literally all you need to do, just to give it a bit of a clean up, make sure there's nothing weird sticking up again. If you drop a hammer or something and you put a dent, you're going to peen material out, so you want to make sure that there's no high spots. That's all sitting beautiful. So this one's now ready to go and have a final clean. Next we've got our worm drive shaft, so we need to give that a good clean up and a bit of sand where it needs it. Okay, there's a wee bit of damage on the shaft that I'll show you. So you can see there's a couple of nicks down in here, and then at the other end you got a couple of big nicks down in there. Something's obviously happened that's caused these big garks. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter because they've machined it down so that it's below the level of the bearing. So the bearing normally sits in this area right there is where the bearing sits, and the seal rubs on this area here. And you can see that's the original material, and they put a little sleeve of something over top. So you've got a beautiful surface for the bearing to rub on. Doesn't matter that the material underneath was a bit pitted and rubbish. So maybe it's an oil leak, I don't know what happened, but something alerted them to danger. They've gone and repaired it, or they've ground it down enough that it doesn't matter anymore. So that one there is ready to have its clean as well. I'm not sure what these two are called, but they basically sling oil off the shaft. So they sit at each end of the shaft with the worm drive in the center, and as the worm drive's driving oil either forward or back, it hits these here and flings it off through centrifugal force. So that shaft does spin quite fast, and it flings it off so that you're not getting an absolute mozza of oil onto the bearings. You don't need that much oil on the bearings, too much, and you're just putting load on your seals. So these here are essentially designed to take a bit of oil load away from the seals.
Nothing new, but it's so good to see you. We do this every day, and I'm still so amazed by you. So hold me tight through the night. Just us two, me and you. Oh, oh, I can't believe you love me. Oh, oh, I just feel so lucky. Oh, oh, still can't believe you love me. Never ends. Let's be more than friends. Yeah. You know I'm here to stay every single day. Yeah. So hold me tight through the night. Just us two, me and you. Oh, oh, I can't believe you love me. Oh, oh, I just feel so lucky. Oh, oh, still can't believe you love me.
I just looked up, and I think over on the marina there they're doing the big plastic sleeves that go onto the piles themselves. So I figure we should go over and have a bit of a gander.
Please check it on the map.
Do you miss me at all? Do you think about the things we used to do? No, you couldn't stand tall. So why didn't you call? So many years has gone by, but I think about you all the time. Looks like you're changing and all, but why didn't you call? Something in the air, always something in the air. Inexplicable, I can feel it in the air. Can you feel me? Can you feel me? Can you feel me? Do you miss me at all? Do you think about the things we used to do? No, you couldn't stand tall. So why didn't you call? So many years has gone by, but I think about you all the time.
This here is our rope gypsy. This allows us to pull lines in over the side of the boat. We've got the two bearings that this shaft runs on, and then two spacers. You can see those run freely on the shaft. This gear here is what does the main drive of this shaft. It's a 40-to-1 reduction from the worm gear. This shaft here to this guy here, and they sit, that engages like that, so it engages perpendicular. A locked steel, we've got a locked steel flange. This is locked onto the shaft itself. We've got a circular brake disc that just gets pressed against this face here and against the face of this bronze chain gypsy. This is the actual chain gypsy itself. This is what physically pulls the chain into the boat. And then on this side, if I rotate it around slightly, you can probably make out there, that there is just another brake disc with a piece of stainless machined up, and then a big nut at this end here. That big nut is basically machined with a fine thread, and that allows us to clamp all of this assembly together so that we can freewheel the chain out and we can clamp it up, and it acts like a brake and locks everything to the shaft itself. Now, this shaft has been remachined for us, it's brand new. So the original shaft had a bend in it. For whatever reason, the shaft was bent. So it wasn't ever going to work. It was going to wear the bearings out really fast. So I had a new shaft machine. That wasn't cheap, but it was something that we saved up over time. We were able to afford to get the shaft done. The bearings, these ones here are relatively cheap. It's about $120 a pair, I think, from memory. And the two bearings that run on this shaft are ludicrously expensive. I think they're about $360 each from memory. It's a while since I bought them. However, we had one of our amazing Patreons, Dave Brooker, donate the money to buy the bearings for that shaft. We weren't going to replace them because they were just way too expensive for us to be able to afford. So we will be installing Brooker bearings, which they will forever be known as. And that allows us to basically correct everything that was going on with the bench shaft and the bearings that were too noisy. Now there is one other thing, and that's the sole reason why we're rebuilding this winch for a second time. This housing here, when we assembled it, what we didn't know was there was a crack just down in here. You can see this crack being dug out and repaired. Basically it's a cast iron housing, so it had to be stick welded with a specific stick. It's not something that I have skills in, so I actually got a workshop in town to do it for me so that they could do it properly. But basically when we rebuilt it, it actually started seeping oil out of here, and that's how we knew it was cracked. We didn't know there was a crack beforehand, otherwise we would have got this repaired last time. Now this nut, normally it's a stainless nut, and it's normally a much coarser pitch than what we've got on here, the thread itself. But I also got it replaced with a common nut. So the shaft itself is expensive, but the nut is really cheap, and this is just a steel nut, and it's going to be replaced whenever we need to. So the fact that this is rusting doesn't bother me. These are, I think, $13 for a new nut versus something like $60 if we were to do $60 to $100 if we were to go with the original design. So we've changed it. We've put a fine thread on it so that we can get a lot more clamping force. Now I do need to weld some things on here and put a wheel on here, so basically I'll turn it into like a locking wheel, but that's why I've gone with basically a cheap nut, so that it's easy to replace down the road.
Tell me if I'm wrong, 'cause it feels like love. Yeah, it feels like love. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Don't know what you do, but you make me feel fine. And you can't deny we are not just kidding.
Normally don't whack bearings, but these are not being used, so it's all right. This rope gypsy is held on with a single bolt. You can see that it's a fine thread and it's machined into the end of the stainless shaft, so a bit of Loctite, and that's what holds that whole gypsy on. The gypsy is keyed to the shaft. Okay, that I'm pretty sure is cast iron. It's just a massive lump of steel basically. You can sort of see it's dimpled in here. It's basically flush, and then it goes into about there, so maybe 2/3 of the way in, and then the rest of it is just solid cast iron, and that's where the key actually runs. So it's a huge chunk of steel. It's a very heavy piece of equipment, but yeah, that'll last 100 years. That thing's just absolutely solid as. Again, don't whack bearings. Lovely. That's the new keyway. Alright, so that's what I need to clean up. This is all relatively new, so this won't take much to give it a clean. It's literally just give it a bit of a wipe down, some brake clean, and we're good to go. This stainless shaft is brand new, so there shouldn't be any imperfections on that. I'll check it over nonetheless, but it should be good to go, this one. There we have it. Parts ready for assembly. Should we get into it? Alright, before we can assemble, again cleaning. So you want to blow out all of the oil galleries. So there's a tray around here that collects oil, and it basically runs it out here and into these bearings. Same on this side, out here and into this bearing. You want to make sure that there's no rubbish sitting anywhere. So blow out all your threads, anything that's a blind thread particularly, blow everything out, blow all your galleries out. But yeah, make sure that you've got no crud in here. This is the last chance to get to make a good job of this. I like to always give it a wipe out with a rag, so the lighter the rag the better, as in colour. Bit of brake clean. Now because we sprayed this with CRC, there's probably going to be some discoloration, which is to be accepted. But you're basically wanting to remove dirt, not necessarily oil from CRC, etc. But the cleaner the rag comes out, the cleaner the job will be. When I worked as an engine reconditioner, one of the mantras that they had was whenever you bore and hone a block, a cylinder, etc., you needed to have it absolutely spotless in order to assemble. So the rule was get a white rag, run it up and down in the bore, and if it comes out anything other than white, it's not clean enough. Alright, nice and clean. We're going to be assembling from the bottom up, so the worm drive shaft is the next to be getting it clean. When I pulled these off the shaft, I marked them, so pretty technical. Rear, front, front, front. It sounds stupid, but this is the front fitting on the shaft, and this is the front face of that fitting. It helps if we've got the shaft around the right way. So that just slides on there like so. And this is rear, front. Right. Time for bearings. So this is a worm drive shaft, and essentially it works by rotating left and right like that. And what that does is it interlocks with some teeth on a large gear, and that either rotates clockwise or counterclockwise depending on what you're doing, whether you're pulling the anchor up or dropping it down. Now what that means is this shaft has a load on it, like front to back load. So the load will either be trying to push the shaft that way or push the shaft that way, just depending on what's happening with the winch at any given time. So the bearings are quite special bearings. Not only do they have to handle rotation in that orientation, they also have to handle force back and forth. So they're thrust bearings. Now, generally thrust bearings are pretty common. However, this is a fairly old winch and it's all imperial, which means imperial thrust bearings are very, very difficult to find. I don't necessarily think we're ever going to be able to find these bearings again. These were seconds in a warehouse that just happened to be on clearance, and we managed to get the last pair. So normally these are $360 each plus freight, so close to say $400 per bearing. There's two of them. One of our Patreons supplied the funds to get these bearings. They're so expensive we weren't going to replace the originals, even though the originals are not in great condition. However, what this means is that this is probably the last time I'll ever be able to rebuild this winch using these bearings. So in the future we may have to machine this shaft and the housing so that we can actually use metric bearings, which are much easier and much more common to get hold of. But for now we've got some really good bearings that were donated by Dave Brooker and his wife. So yeah, incredibly grateful to have these. It's the first time we've actually been able to put these new bearings into this winch. There we have it. Lovely, beautiful bearings. So these are without any lubrication in them at the moment, so they're a little bit noisier than normal, although they are brand new, so they're still in good nick. You can hear that little clack, clack, clack. That's the clearance in the bearings. As soon as you get a bit of oil in there, that noise will go away. Okay, so we assemble this from the back, or do we? I can't remember actually. No, you know what? You take a bearing off. I made a mistake. I realised that you have to put one bearing on at a time, because if you put both on you can't get it through the housing. So you fit one bearing, slide the shaft into place, and then fit the last bearing behind it all. So let's do it that way. You can see that it's now flush with the housing itself. The bearing is flush with the housing, but they've got to go in a bit further. So if you look at these housings here that go on the end of each bearing surface, essentially this here butts up against the bearing and it pushes it in. So that's probably a good inch, well maybe even more, inch and a quarter, something like that. That's how far they've each got to go in. They're both about the same. So now it's time to bolt those up. Put some sealant around this edge here so that we've got a nice oil tight seal, but also this here will be pushing in that bearing to the right location. So whenever we're doing seals, putting them onto a shaft, you want to make sure you got a bit of oil. So this is actually just air tool oil. It doesn't actually matter what sort of oil, it can be motor oil, vegetable oil if you really want to go silly. Just has to basically give it lubrication. So you just want to make sure that the seal surface has plenty of oil on it, just so that you've got a really good slippery surface. That seal's not going to get damaged on the way in. Now we've got an oil drain down in here, so you want to make sure that that's at the bottom. Okay, that should just slide over like that. Perfect. Oil drain at the bottom, lovely. Right, they are not going to be long enough.
Normally you can fit a housing in like this by putting a couple of bolts in and just tightening it up.
So I'm just going to tap this in to get that bearing in a little bit further, and then I'm going to get these in and wind the bolts in.
Now that the bearing's fitted, Dame's removing the housing to give it a final clean, put the sealant on, and then pull it in flush using the bolts.
So we want to bead all the way around. that's what we have. So I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to tighten it all the way up. I want to have this RTV set, and then I'm going to clamp it up so that I've got a little bit of a gap that gets squished with that RTV.
Or is this how it should be? You made me sing about love. So just tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like love. Yeah, it feels like love. Yeah! Don't know what you do, but you make me feel fine. And you can't deny we are not just killing time. You should let me know if you want this true. Baby, you just make me feel crazy. A little crazy for you. A little crazy for you. Hey.
A little crazy for you now. A little crazy for you now, baby. I'm a little crazy for you now. A little crazy for you now. A little crazy for you now, baby.
Don't know what you do, but you make me feel fine. And you can't deny we are not just killing.
That's the shaft done, so that's the worm drive. So as it spins forward and back, you can sort of see it basically drives, you can imagine gears sliding forward and back on this. So that's nice and loose. At the same time, there's no real play in that at all, so that's going to be beautiful once that's oiled up. Because of the design of that worm gear, it's like a screw, so as you're winding it either left or right, it's going to push oil one way or the other, and it's going to push it against the ends of this housing, into the bearings, and then into the seals. The seals don't, you don't want them doing heaps and heaps of work, and the bearings don't need a huge amount of oil. So these, this metal plate here and this metal plate here are both designed to basically fling the oil off in a centrifugal way. This shaft will spin quite fast, and that helps unload the oil load that those bearings and seals have to deal with. Right, time to start putting this piece together. So, a couple of bearings and a couple of spacers. That's the only equipment that's on this shaft. Now, if you look at these spacers, they're made out of just sort of old manky bits of old pipe. There's quite a lot of corrosion, and none of that actually makes any difference. What matters is that that face and that face are both smooth, and that the diameter is consistent, and that's the case on both of them. That's why they're made out of just whatever's lying around. So these go on this shaft on either side, and then it's time. Stay. All right. So you can see they're quite slippery. There's not a lot of there's quite a bit of clearance there for them. Now these bearings are essentially the cheaper of the 4 bearings in this winch. These are not thrust bearings, so they're just straight roller bearings. So these are new bearings. There we go. Stay. These bearings are able to be replaced when we need them. Because they're not thrust bearings, they're much easier to get. They're still imperial, so they're still like quite expensive compared to metric equivalents. But these, I think these are about 120 bucks for the 2, so they're substantially cheaper than the thrust bearings. Chain gypsies on this side. There. Here you can see basically turning this lower shaft rotates that top gear around like that. So this is a good example. Rotating this bottom shaft here with a hydraulic motor ends up turning this shaft in a reduction gear system. So for every 40 turns of this shaft, we get 1 turn of this shaft here, and that's simply because of the size difference between the gears on this cog here and essentially the amount of teeth or the gear size on the worm drive. So it's quite small versus quite large. You end up with a 40 to 1 reduction in this gearbox. So the beauty of a reduction gearbox like this, Winch, essentially it is just a gearbox. Now the beauty of a reduction system like what this is, for every 40 rotations of that hydraulic motor we get 1 rotation on the chain gypsy, and it means that we get essentially a 40 times increase on the horsepower of that motor. So you can have a relatively small motor and you can lift an enormous amount of weight. So we've only got a wee hydraulic motor, tiny little thing like this, and it can lift 2 ton. There's just no way that that would be possible without a reduction gear system. This whole thing needs to be oil lubricated, but there's no oil pump in this system. Now the way that they do it is essentially a splash lubrication system. So as this gear here is spinning around in this direction here, it's going to fling oil up this back end. It's going to pick it up from down the bottom and fling it up like a big paddle wheel. If you have a look down in here, there's a neat little oil system that they use. Basically the oil is caught in this wee area here, this little gully that's cast into the steel, and essentially it runs down either side. There's a hole there and there's a hole over there, and that passes out into the bearings on the side here, so it lubricates these side bearings. So this these teeth are always lubricated because they dip into the oil that's at the very bottom of this housing and then fling it around the rest of the housing. Not only does it run down the sides of the housing, but it's also caught in this area. Now to enhance what this can do, simple little contraption, it looks a bit ratty, but this is basically a piece of tin that gets bolted down in there like that, so it goes very, very close to those teeth and essentially catches as much oil as possible flinging off, and you can sort of see it's designed to catch that oil and then direct it all back into this tray. So it's a neat little system that does all of the lubrication needed for this gearbox to work. These are the 2 original machine screws that are holding that tin plate in. I'm brave, but I'm not brave enough to wire brush those. So I went over and got a couple of stainless. We'll just replace them. You can see down there just how close that actually runs to the wheel. Okay, the next thing about this that differs from something like, say, an engine is the way that they're lubricated. So an engine has essentially oil to lubricate it to make sure everything's nice and slippery, and that oil has a rating, so it might be, say, 1540, and basically it's the thickness, that measurement is essentially the thickness of oil at different temperatures, so hot and cold. Now, this doesn't run long enough to essentially get hot in the same way that an engine does. An engine might start and turn off 6 hours later. This might start and be lucky if it's still running 5 minutes later. So normally this sits for months at a time, and then it'll get a big burst of use, and then it'll sit for another month or so at a time, and then it'll get a big burst of use. So it's very infrequent, and it's also high load when it's being used, but it's only ever used for a very short period of time. So that changes what you do with the oil. So you don't want to use a thin oil, like you'd never use essentially car oil in this, because you're just not going to have enough pressure resistance in that oil to keep your gears and everything in good condition. It would definitely fling around, it would lubricate the bearings, and the bearings would probably be okay with something light like an engine oil, but the gears themselves are the bit that's going to wear, and that's the bit that's expensive to replace and the bit you want to protect. We do two different things. So we've got oil. We actually also put grease inside this here. Now, some trawlers use 100% grease. In this case, we're not. We're going to use about 50% of a tube. It's not going to be a 50-50 ratio of oil to grease, but it's going to be about half a tube of grease, and then the rest is going to be oil. Now, the bungs on this aren't very high, so it only ever has maybe 2 inches of oil at the bottom. I don't really like the idea of running it so low. I would prefer to actually almost double that and have a bit more oil in there, because I can't see a negative of having too much oil in there. It's not like an engine where it's going to over pressurize the crankcase, you know, with the pistons creating combustion, over pressurize the crankcase and then blow it out the top, blow the oil out the top. If anything, it's just going to fling a bit more oil around. It may put a bit more load on the side seals and so on, but I can't see that they wouldn't handle that. So me personally, I'm actually going to run probably double what the normal amount of oil in this casing would be. And one of the reasons for that is also the casing's on a slight angle. So the front of the boat is higher than the back of the boat, so the casing sits on a slight angle. Obviously this is quite exaggerated, but what that means is with the measuring point down the back end, you're going to end up with less oil generally than if that housing was sitting dead flat. So for me, I'm going to actually run it slightly high, and I think that'll be okay. And if it's not, worst case scenario is I'll get a few oil leaks, and I can just take some oil out.
Out in stormy weather, I might have the blues, but nothing ever stopped me from dusting off my shoes. You might think you'll see me falling the ground. But I threw up my umbrella when rain stops hitting down. Yeah. On a bad day, on a good day, I don't need no sunshine, 'cause I'm dancing with the rain. You will see me running, thinking I might be.
Before I get carried away cranking these up, I want to fit these side housings because these are going to align these two housings in the right orientation. There's a slight protrusion. You can feel this one's proud, this one isn't. So this here has a little bit of a twist that we need to deal with. So time to fit these.
I don't need no sunshine, you keep me going strong. I just need my happy face to keep me moving on.
I've had to make a couple of weather-related changes to the international winch rebuilding facility located in Bundaberg. People sometimes say to us, why do we want to go to Antarctica and why do we want to go to some of these ridiculously inhospitable places? And I give you this, I mean, this is flippin' amazing. Look at the weather. Look, small children could be blown over in this.
Looking out the window, reflecting who I am. No one ever stopped me, not even Uncle Sam. Life might be a struggle, life might be a fight, but I am here to show the world that I can make it right. On a bad day, on a good day.
We have to paint the winch, which means we have to decide on the deck colour and machinery colour. So that's what we've done. Machinery is the red or crimson, the yellow gold is the deck surface, and non-slip traffic areas is neutral grey.